I would like to send and extend a warm welcome to all families and friends who are able to join us live today. Happy Easter to all. Due to COVID-19, we're not able to come together today, but that will not stop us from praising our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who has risen. I ask that wherever you are, whether you're at home or at work, continue to give Him all the glory, honor, and praise, because our God is alive. Vivi'i
tō atu I ngā tau atu I ona so o a tōno Peter. E momo atu o ia I a tau tōu I Kalileia. Tō te loa I o ia I neme. Whapei o na wheta laia tuai o ia I a tau tōu. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni." Let us pray. A whio mai anga a Paiai I le tapu ina a whaia nei. Ia mātou no mona ai le tue tū o lau whio e le ngata I le lona. Ai whape fōi o mātou tangata manu. Soso I mai ai mātou whamausia o mātou whatutua. Ni mātou I loa I o tapu aki I lau whio I le ngāma na whamau. Lo swafa Yesu wa laila mātou tita. Amen. O pese o samia o pese. fionga le tua la tātou whaitawina. O le evangelia Ioane o mta upo e luas fulu. La whaitawina le upo e sfutasi e whangata mai le upo e sfumalvalu. Our reading this morning is taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 20. Verses 1 to 18 is the entire story. I'll be reading in Samoan verses 11 to verse 18. The scripture this morning is taken from the book of John, chapter 20. The entire pericope is from the first verse to the 18th verse. I'll be reading verses 11 to 18 in Samoan. O tusi o fifilia mo le nei aso o le eseta o le Ioane o ta o penusufulu la o whaitawina le whopusufutasi e whapamaina whopusufumalapamu. Au Maria o tu o ia I whafo e la taane I le tumamau, o tangi ai. O tangi o ia mapunau I le tumamau, o nei loa atu le e ia o angelu e tōlua o ofu I ofu sisina. O na nofo I le mea na tuaina tino Iesu, o le tasi I iulu, o le tasi I vai. O la fe mai ia te ia funai, se ale mea te tangi ai. O whape atu ia ia te ngā ua. O wā walato o the ese lo o lii. O te leilo fo I le mea walato tu wina ai o ia. O ia whai atu nā upu o na whaliu le I tua. O na iloa atu le e ia o Iesu o tu mai. A le iloa e ia o Iesu lava lea. Whetalai atu Iesu ia te ia funai. Se ale mea e te tangia. Oi ea te sāia. Al fine whate ia o le leo ia o le whanua o whamai ia te ia. Le li ie. A whai wa ea me ese ia te ia. Ta mai ia te aku po whele mea o e tu wina ai o ia. Ona o aweseina le o ia. O whetala atu Iesu ia te ia, Mariai. O na whaliu leo o ia o whamai ia te ia. O Raponi, o lona winga le awa oe. O whetala atu Iesu ia te ia, au e te tango mai ia te a. O wā o te le ia wae, lava I lota mā. Ai e alu I o uso ma whai atu ia I la tō. O te aluae I lota mā ma lo o tauta mā. O lo o tua ma lo o tau tua. Wa aluatu Maria le makatala. O whape atu I le uso. O owi lo atu le li. O ia whae lo atu fo I a te ngato. O whetalai mai e ia o ia mea I a te ia. Ia te le maile tua ala tātou whitau ma whaamolongo I upo la nā whionga pa ia. Tuma watu pe ia te ia la lava vi'i. Nei se karo I le whanga whau. Pea nei ama noe, whatalofa atu ai le pa ia mana malu la tātou o rotu second samoan. La tātou o lo mawhaiona maua maila tātou o whasalaunga I le nei. Tai ao le seta, e mea ia musui o le tina ia mareta ma matu aima. E mori te le atu whamanuiama le seta. I la tātou le kalisia I le nei tai ao. When you believe in the resurrection, let me just preface my remarks with this self-evident truth, that you believe. You believe in something. As a human person, we have this proclivity at the core of our being to believe, to hold something to be true, with or without evidence. Look around you. You have to believe at some fundamental level that the building that we're occupying, that was built in 1924, will not collapse on us, even though we didn't participate in its construction. When you travel by plane, you have to believe that the pilot has done this before, and that she will fly you safely to your final destination. You have to believe. You can't just be up and about in the world unless you believe. Think about it. When you're traveling down the highway, you have to believe that the person on the other side will not cross the median and crash into your car. You have to believe that the food you purchase from the food vendors are not laced with chemicals that might be harmful for you. You have to believe. Our society will come to a standstill without a belief system. And this morning is Easter Sunday. And for Christians, it's a reminder of what has kept our faith and community intact over the generations. And that's our belief in the resurrection. So the first point I'd like to make this morning is that when you believe in the resurrection, death ceases to have a hold on you. There's no question about it that death causes anxiety for many folks. And they have reason to believe that. They have reason to be afraid, to be concerned of dying. The pain that's associated with death is so real. Perhaps they had experienced the death of a grandparent that left a void in their hearts. Someone you loved has passed away and has made you sad. Your mother may have passed away and you remember, like it was yesterday, how painful that moment was in your young life. May have been a few years, but you can still feel the void, the emptiness in your stomach. You carry with you those painful memories, those initial days and weeks and months after the passing. So when you believe in the resurrection, that death no longer has a hold on you. That pain becomes optional. Why? Because you know there's something else. There's something else besides death. When you distinguish pain, if you stay with it a little closer, you'll distinguish peace as well. You'll distinguish joy, hope, that's brought about by the resurrection. And by death, I'm also talking about when you grieve the loss of a job. The pain that's associated with the loss of a pet, the loss of your abilities. You get a call from your doctor. The test came back positive, and you have a few weeks to live. I'm talking about that death. When your son gets thrown into prison and you can't afford a good attorney. I'm talking about that death. When the leader that you admire and hold in high esteem disappoints you, I'm talking about the pain of that death. And when you find out that your spouse has cheated on you, it's that death I'm talking about, the death of an ideal. When you believe in the resurrection, that death will cease to keep you down. And I'm not just talking about deaths that you may not have known, deaths that it didn't occur to you, accident on the freeway. I'm not talking about that death only, but I'm also talking about the deaths that you don't know that you don't know. The deaths that you don't have any comment about because, as far as you're concerned, they don't exist. When you believe in the resurrection, even those deaths will lose their sting. When Mary of Magdala went to the tomb on that first Easter morning, she saw the stone rolled away. So she went back and got the boys, Simon, Peter, and John, brought them to the tomb, and after they saw the empty tomb, they went home. But Mary lingered. She stayed behind, crying at the tomb. She had a heavy heart. Her friend, her teacher, her master had passed away. Jesus meant everything for her. She looked in the grave and saw two angels. She was crying, and they asked her, "Why are you crying?" Mary said, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've taken him." After she said that, she turned around and she saw the gardener. And when she asked him to tell her where they've taken the body, the gardener calls her by her name. The gardener said, "Mary." Can you imagine the look in her eyes as she turns and looks at his? You remember what she said? She said, "Teacher," in Hebrew. I'm telling you the story to say that even the death of her ideals, even the death of her hopes and aspirations, even the death of what she didn't know that didn't know, were resurrected when she believed that day. And because Mary believed in the resurrection 2,000 plus years ago, you and I get to relive her story in the 21st century. Let me ask you a question. When did Mary start to believe in the resurrection? When did it really sink in to her, the meaning of resurrection? The answer is when she heard her name. When she heard her name called, that's when it sunk into her. She was the first to see the stone roll away. That didn't register resurrection for her. So we went and got Peter and John, and they all witnessed the empty tomb. That didn't register resurrection for her. She had a discourse with the two angels that were in the tomb. They had a conversation. They had an engagement. That didn't register resurrection for her. It wasn't until he called her by her name. Think about the things that you believe in, or things that you used to believe in, but not anymore. When did you make the switch? The answer was when you heard your name. When it became personal, when the issue was so close to home, when the truth became so compelling, when you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that what you used to hang on to is no longer true, that's when the switch happens. You see, for Mary, the truth was that her best friend had passed on.
For her, the truth was that she's got this empty feeling in her stomach, this void, this death that's got a grip on her in so many different ways. And it made her sad. Perhaps she regretted a few things. Wish I had done this while he was here. Perhaps she was angry at herself, angry at God. Perhaps both. It was a depression she couldn't shake. That was the truth for her that morning, until she heard her name called. That was when she snapped out of it. That was when the resurrection became real for her. When Jesus called her by name, that was when she believed. The second point I wanted to make is when you believe in the resurrection, telling others about it is life-changing. For Christians, they call it evangelism. It brought Christianity to our shores in 1830. When you believe in the resurrection, evangelism becomes life-giving. Teachers know this when they're going through their lesson plan and their curriculum that drives into a pedagogy. They themselves go through it again before the students get it. When you believe in the resurrection, the telling of this story is what gives life. Evangelism, it's when someone gets the story in such a way that it lifts them up. It's when they come to realize that death is not the final word, that it gets them moved, touches them, and inspires them so that they leave the comfort of their England home base to embark on this call to adventure, if you will, to travel to the South Seas, shipwrecked in Rarotonga, landed in Tahiti, and then picked himself up and continued on to Samoa. I'm talking about John Williams on the Messenger of Peace. Savalio Filemu, he so got resurrection in a real way that he left his home to travel to our shores, to bring gospel to our people. John Williams was 34 when he brought Christianity to the Samoan archipelago. When you believe in the resurrection, when death has no hold on you, then telling others about the story can be life-giving. John Williams died in 1839 at the age of 43. But his story lives on, continues on, after 190 years of conversion. But I'm not just talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because for some that may be not real. But I'm talking about sharing a resurrection story of one that has come back from the dead in all its pluriformity. Someone who has overcome fear. Someone who was shy, but is now a social butterfly. Someone who gave up who she was for who she could become. I'm talking about a transformation. I'm talking about a localized resurrection that's meaningful. When you believe in the resurrection and when you share that story, it's life-giving to some. In our reading this morning, John tells us that when Mary heard her name and recognized Jesus and distinguished for herself resurrection. She must have tried to leap into his arms. But Jesus tells her not to hold on to him just yet, but go to his disciples, his brothers, and tell them the good news. Tell them that I live. As Christians, this is our job description, to tell the story of the resurrection, to embody the story of resurrection, tell it in our own words, based on our own encounters and personal experience. And in the process of telling that story, you get it again, and they get it. The third point I'd like to make is when you believe in the resurrection, it frees you up from limitations of space and time. We all know our reality. You can't be here and there at the same time. It's the state of our existence. It's this condition that we're born into. We're born into these limitations prescribed by time and space. But when you believe in the resurrection, it frees you up from these limitations. If you really take a closer look at the breakdowns, the chaos, the fear, the deaths, the upsets, it exists in this time-space continuum. But the resurrection invites us to a different reality, an alternate reality that allows us to see what God is doing in the world. It frees us up from space and time. And you would think that freedom will come by eliminating time and space, but that's not where the freedom lies. The freedom lies when we befriend time and space. It's the conversation between good and evil. How do we free ourselves from evil? It's not by the elimination of evil, but it's by befriending evil. Receiving evil in our own terms. When you believe in the resurrection, it frees you up from the limitations of space and time. We see death as a natural thing, a portal for another form of life. We see time as not confined to our personal and individual time, but we see eternity and then beyond. What we do today will be felt into eternity. Our bodies will continue to die, but death will no longer sting anymore. Our faith has been with us for over 2,000 years. And since the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, we've not had a meaningful iteration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ until now. With the advances in technology, science, modern medicine, quantum mechanics, there is now a confluence of forces that supports a theology that has always been part of our narrative. And that is, you were made in the image of God. I am made in the image of God. Your neighbor is made in the image of God. This new iteration of the story of resurrection will no longer be confined by space and time. But now we have an opportunity to transcend the limitations of time and space. When you believe in the resurrection, we're no longer confined by our limitations. And then finally, when you believe in the resurrection, you know that you're forgiven. One of the wonderful things about sheltering in place is that it has given us the time we need to be with ourselves, to self-reflect, to think deeply about who we are, what we do, why we're here. Christians have always done this through fasting and other spiritual grounding practices. But now with COVID-19, the entire globe is doing it. Real time. And upon reflecting upon it, these face masks that we're now wearing, we realize we've been wearing them all along. Self-reflecting. We saw that there's certain identities that we put out. Because of fear, we have good reasons for it. The masks that we put out there, self-selecting our faces for public consumption. When we think about social distancing, turns out to be a lifesaver during these times of crisis. But we've always held it as a healthy relationship between the divine and us. There was always this distancing. God is God, and we're not. The truth is, you are the only one that knows all that you've done. You're the only one. You carry that knowledge in your body. You store it in your DNA. You carry it in the core of your being. Being with ourselves the last 3-4 weeks have allowed us to come in contact with our inner self, our younger self, our Totalititi self. I just hope that you're able to befriend that part of who you are. In our story, each one of those disciples and followers felt bad when Jesus died. Everyone felt that they could have done something more. They could have been more vocal. They could have done something to prevent this tragedy from happening. But it did happen. They didn't have time. It happened so quickly. Didn't have time to react properly. And all the disciples, they felt guilty, regrets, perhaps resentment, anger, bitterness, malice towards others. They knew deep in their hearts that something went terribly wrong, and they didn't stand up against it. It's been 3 days since he was crucified. But then this morning, when the women who went to the tomb earlier, before the sun came up, were beginning to talk this resurrection story, came back and shared with him what they've seen. And then they said to themselves, could this be true? Could it be true that we get a do-over? We get a second opportunity to love the Lord more deeply, more closely, to follow his commandments more obediently, to be less willful about our own personal agenda. And when Jesus finally revealed himself and said, "Peace be with you," it was clear to the disciples that they were forgiven. Knowing that Jesus has forgiven them, knowing that Jesus has let the bygones be bygones, each and every one of those disciples gave their lives for the cause. There's no question we live in interesting times. The global shutdown is a reset at so many levels. And as people of the book, we are custodians of what God has done in the past. And from that shared human history, we can connect the dots and infer what God is doing in the future. Pope Francis, in a letter to community leaders this morning, urged us to reflect on life after the pandemic, that this too shall pass, and that we should get on with the, quote, project of integral human development that we long for, that is based on the central role and initiative of the people in all their diversity, end quote. This is what the resurrection is about. This is about constructing and co-creating with God a future that's yet to be, and a future that includes everyone made in the image of God in all of its diversity. Pope Francis went on to say that he hopes this global shutdown will, quote, free us from operating on automatic pilot and allow a humanist and ecological conversion that puts an end to the idolatry of money and places human life and dignity at the center. This is the message of the Easter. It's a God that so loved the world that he prepared salvation for all of us. Let me end by saying, you are going to believe anyway. Why not believe in the resurrection? You're going to lose your life anyway. Why not lose it for something that frees you up from death, liberates you from the confines of time and space, and a belief that offers forgiveness as a basis for engagement? Upo se fu valu le tusi na tatu fai tau ma whakamolongo i ai. Wa watu Maria le makatala ua whape atu I leo so. Ua owi lo atu mele. A whapela vai eise whanau ngā leo ona I le nei e seta o le lua afe lua se fu. O le nei. Iau ngāra tātou tāpo inga, iau ngā tātou whetau ngā tusi, iau ngā pespesenga nai ta mai tai, ina ia tātou I loa I lena. A tātou I loa le lingi o le tātou I loa la ia o lona manatu, o lona ngā, o lona mauri. Fina ngalo o ia I le manuia. E fina ngalo o ia I le fiafia. E fina ngalo o ia mo le whakamoe ola. Mo tangata uma. E lena tātou le au whatutua e mo tangata uma lava. Wa o nena na reina sa wake. Sau le li e whaai loa mai I ai tātou le nganga o le tua. Le tua lena na whaia le langi, le rangi na whaia I tātou I lona lava whatusa. Ma o le nganga o le tua. O le alofa I tangata. O la tatalo ia whalau te leina e le nganga o le tua, le uringa moni o le nā alofa. Le mai ese tosi o le alofa. E ma whaia na ti ngā le alofa. E ma whaia na whanono le alofa. Ma fai foi ona fia le lofa. A le lofa la metasi.
Te lofa lava e tasi e le manatu ai le ni. O lona winga tutusa ma le atua o se mea e mau. E ta ofi mau. Ana wha mau o lalo o ia e ia lau. Whai mo ia le winga o le pula. Ina ia le ngata ia tātou I loa le atua ato atua. A ia si la fia fo ia le atua o tātou tangata te tutasi. Ia manuia te lele e seta I tātou I Kalesia, second Samoan. Te whanei awa noa e fasisi la tua e o lo tātou whatasi ma le sunga toina I Akarete, ma lo whatua I vonga ma ia whono. O pumoni lava so se mea tātou tu. Ta ape ai, whatalo loa I el whanau o le tu. O lo iai I lo tātou vainga I lana Kalesia. O omi lo atu le di. O la utalo le nā mo I tātou. I le suafo Yesu. Amen.
God sent His Son. They called Him Jesus. He came to love, heal, and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. And because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, every single fear is gone. And because I know, yes, I know that He holds our future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. Now I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. Let all creation testify. Let this not
te lava tatou whepese. Ala tatou whai o tana. Let us pray. We've come to the end of our worship. Now it's time to go out in the world and embody this message of resurrection in our lives. We ask that you give us the boldness, courage to go out and do likewise. O mato o ele singui o le nei tapo ina. To whawhango me foki ai mātou leo winga o le toitu o la ofi. O le mātou tō mana. I iai mātou le toa. I iai mātou le malosa. Mātou tō atu e le lorani ma ola ni sofuanga ma ni ola. O lo mori ma wina ai le winga toitu o la ofi o le. O le mātou tūua. E tumo mai o mātou luna, le lofa tuno tele o Yesu Kiriso o mātou i whaola. Le lofa mutu vale o le atua o tama. E man mawhutanga le motusia ma lo nganga pa ia. E lunga le iai mātou ma lau whanau whatutua le rangi awa. Nei se yo o i whakavau i whakavau.